Blockchain Capital was basically a surrogate fund to funnel Epstein's investments into early stage Bitcoin companies. And Brock Pierce himself kind of seemed to serve this liaison role, matching Epstein with potential investments.
I don't think he was looking to like influence Bitcoin Core development because, like I said, he's funding Gavin Andresen and the other guys at MIT, and then he's also funding Blockstream. And plus, Bitcoin, the way it works inherently, is meant to avoid that kind of manipulation in the first place because it is this open source system where anyone can contribute. Even if he tried to do that, I don't think it would work.
Welcome back to the Blockspace Pod, brought to you by CleanSpark. Was Jeffrey Epstein trying to write Bitcoin regulations? Did he co-opt Core? Or was he simply trying to steer Bitcoin early stage startups like Coinbase and Blockstream, or all of the above? Or was he just trying to keep his fingers on the pulse of things going on with Bitcoin? There's a lot to unpack in the most recent Epstein files dump. So for today's show, we have veteran Bitcoin journalist Kyle Torpey on to do just that. Kyle has had some fantastic original reporting on the Epstein files, unearthing some things that no one else was able to find, like the fact that Epstein met with Ben Lawsky, the architect of the infamous Bit license, in 2014, and an interesting investor letter from Coinbase's Brian Armstrong that relates to the Blocksize Wars. You will not want to miss this episode if you are interested in Bitcoin history and lore and want to figure out what exactly was going on with Bitcoin in the Epstein files. So give this one a listen if you're interested in those. We will be right back. Kyle Torpey, welcome to the Blockspace podcast, sir. How you doing?
I'm well. Thanks for having me. I've been following your work for a while. I'm a pretty big fan.
This is a, meeting of minds for me in some senses. I feel like we've been, running in the same circles with Bitcoin journalism for a while, and we've never actually had an in-person conversation or virtual one. So I'm happy we could finally strike that off the list. I wish it were over something maybe a little more lighthearted, but we take what we can get in the news cycle. And to kick it off, we've done some coverage at Blockspace of the Epstein files. We had a live stream the week that they were released, and I did an article for Blockspace for the newsletter last week, kind of covering some of the more high level and more interesting parts of it. Not coming at the best time because Bitcoin just puked to like 60K. So I don't think people were that glued to this. They were glued to the price chart. But to start us off, can you give us a rundown of maybe like some of the most salient things you found in the filings and things that you think are the most important for people to take a look at?
Yeah, I'll just kind of go through like how I came into going through the files and stuff. So they were released on that Friday, I think. And then I started seeing stuff about Bitcoin and Blockstream that Saturday, I guess a little over a week ago. And people were saying this is like proves Epstein like created Bitcoin and like Epstein was involved with Blockstream and telling them what to do and all that kind of stuff. And it was coming from, I think anything with the Epstein files, you kind of have to look into it for yourself because there's a lot of like crazy kind of accusations that get thrown around stuff too, just from someone's name being in the files, or like, oh, this guy's obviously needs to be arrested now. So with like the Blockstream angle, especially, like they were very relevant at the time of the Blocksize Wars, which is something I covered heavily at Bitcoin Magazine and Forbes. So I kind of wanted to see if there was like any specific discussion around that. So I just went to the DOJ website, typed in block size, different like hard fork, just like different terms that would, bring up anything relevant. And the first thing that came up, I think the only thing I found, was a investment letter sent by Coinbase CEO Brian Armstrong, just like a regular routine, seemed like monthly letter he would send out to anyone who invested in the company. And it was during the Blocksize, well, I forget the actual date, but it was around the time Bitcoin Classic was like the big push, I think. Bitcoin XT was the original hard fork proposal from Gavin Andresen, and Mike Hearn was involved with that as well, two like early prominent Bitcoin developers. And he was, Armstrong in the email was talking about how they're like working behind the scenes to make sure, and yeah, you can see it right there, that, the Bitcoin network in their view of what it should be used for is not going to be held back by any early idealists who think it should remain like as decentralized as possible. So I mean, there was a lot of companies, Coinbase wasn't the only one at the time, who were very interested in the use of Bitcoin for payments, which we still see some today, but it's more on like the secondary layers with like Lightning Network and stuff like that. But a lot of these companies were building around, doing these on-chain payments that weren't necessarily going to scale over the long term. So they had these entire business models built around, Bitcoin on-chain payments that were eventually going to run out of space on the blockchain. And we saw that the next year with the fees going up and everything. So that was the first thing, I really saw. And I just thought it was interesting because it wasn't necessarily like a big revelation because everyone knew Coinbase. They were like pretty loud at the time about how we needed to increase the block size limit and stuff like that. But to see it like laid out that bluntly and clearly to his investors, where it's like, we're working behind the scenes and we're going to get this hard fork passed in the next, I think he also says like in the next month or two, I think there's going to be a hard fork. Obviously it never happened. And so, yeah, then the obvious next step from that.
Oh, so, sorry, Kyle. Quick, just to put a pin in that thought really quickly, because I just want to highlight this for those who might not know the history as well. For SegWit2x, can you break down what SegWit2x was and the New York agreement that Coinbase was a part of, correct?
Yeah, so this was before the New York agreement and SegWit2x. There was like multiple hard fork proposals. There was, as I said, Bitcoin XT and then Bitcoin Classic and then Bitcoin Unlimited. And they just weren't getting enough support from the general Bitcoin user base. So finally, a bunch of companies got together and said, we're going to need some kind of compromise. And we're just all going to say we're going to do the hard fork and we're going to do it a year from now. And that was the so-called New York agreement. Coinbase was one of the companies that signed. It was the major exchanges, major blockchain providers like blockchain.info, and something like around 90% of the hash rate. So it was like pretty much all the big players in the space were pushing for it. Notably, the Bitcoin core developers were not pushing for it at all. They were like one of the main, basically the Bitcoin core technical community was not for that at all. So then the compromise was supposed to be the segregated witness change, which is a soft fork to slightly increase the block size limit and do a technical change that fixed some bugs with how the Lightning Network works. So it's basically a way to make sure that would be a scaling path going forward as well. And then the hard fork was supposed to happen like 6 months after that, it's really unclear like why, because I guess it was just to appease the people that were holding back on SegWit, because they wanted like more block space as well. So like everybody pretty much wanted SegWit, and the people that were holding out basically were holding out because they're like, no, we need to do SegWit and this hard fork. And so the compromise was basically to do both, but they weren't done. They weren't going to be implemented at the same time, which creates the question of if it was just like a way for some people to save face, so they could just like do SegWit first and then kind of abandon the hard forking part after that.
Yeah, and it failed roughly like circa like November 2017, right?
Yeah, there was Eric Voorhees and a couple of other signatories from the agreement sent out an email to the mailing list that was like, we're not gonna support this anymore. I think that was like a month before it was supposed to activate. And then I think some people were still looking to activate it anyways, and there was some kind of bug in the code where there was like a one off by one error where it would have caused some kind of network issue. I forget the specifics on that, but I remember that happening as well.
Just to your point, a crazy thing to pop up in the Epstein files, you don't really expect that. I don't think anyone had that on their bingo card, even with, people seeing some of the ties to Bitcoin developers in the first dump that the DOJ did last year. I think that's the most interesting part about a lot of this, though, to what you're saying. There are just these little tidbits of Bitcoin trivia and lore that you can unearth from this, like the fact that Brock Pierce was trying to purchase Mt. Gox back in 2014 before it went belly up.
Right, yeah.
But just wanted to lay that out for people who might be confused about what exactly we're talking about within Bitcoin history, because that was 10 years ago. So continue with some of the more interesting things that you found or your insights.
So once I found that and like put it out, and that was like kind of interesting, the obvious next question was, why is there an email from Brian Armstrong, an investor letter to Coinbase investors in the Epstein files? And why is it being sent to Jeffrey Epstein? And it was being forwarded to him by Brock Pierce. And so then I went down that rabbit hole a little bit and just kind of tried to go through more of their emails and more emails related to Coinbase, and was eventually able to see that Epstein had sent Pierce an email, or no, Pierce sent Epstein an email being like, I need to know if you're going to get into this Coinbase deal. I need to know by the end of the day because they're going to end this round of funding. And Epstein tells Brock to, put in $3 million for him. And then it looks like later on, I want to say 2018 maybe, there's more interactions with them and Blockchain Capital, where they're helping Epstein offload half of the shares for $15 million around there. I think Blockchain Capital did say the deal did not go through them, in that because there's like a Decrypt article that came out that Monday as well that kind of summarized all the Coinbase stuff. But I mean, it looked like from what I saw, it was like all going through Brock Pierce and Blockchain Capital.
Yeah, I mean, from everything that I've picked out too, you can go, there's actually Deutsche Bank transaction records. And if you go through for February 2018, a month after they were discussing buying Epstein's stake, originally they wanted to do 100%. They settled on 50% for 15 million, like you said. But there are 3 different payments totaling 15 million to what's called the 2017 Caterpillar Trust, which I assume is related to Epstein. I actually haven't been able to find too much about that trust. There are a few articles out there that link it to Epstein, but it lives in that universe of all of these shell companies that Epstein and his cabal use to shuffle money back and forth, right? And they might be able to say that Blockchain Capital didn't do it because it was one of their funds. So Blockchain Capital has like all these, they call them cryptocurrency partner LPs, and it's like all of the different tranches that they would use to deploy. So like I think the first year it was the first LP, and then the second year is the second LP. They actually set up, I think, a different LLC for Epstein's purchase specifically, which is another thing that was really popular, is they would set up a shell company like an LLC, and then that would buy, they'd use the LLC to invest into a company like Coinbase. And then, Blockchain Capital is basically asking if they can buy that LLC, because that's who holds the shares. So it's interesting to look into the files and see this, how these money games are played with all these shell companies. This is something that Whitney Webb and Mark Goodwin have been really good about in their reporting on the Epstein files, or really Whitney Webb specifically for Epstein, how he would use money and shuffle it around. But it's interesting that Blockchain Capital is trying to push back on that, because as you said, in the files, like the paper trail is very clear. There's nothing definitely linking that $15 million payment necessarily to this. Like there's no memo in the Deutsche Bank files. Like there's one for a Blockstream investment, which we'll get to later, but there's no memo directly linking those. But the 15 million coming just after they talked about spending 50 million on this, coming from Blockchain Capital, maybe it was something else, but if you put 2 and 2 together, it seems pretty clear that that's probably what that was for.
Yeah, but other than the Coinbase connection, after that, I think it was a couple days later even, I was just kind of searching the files again with like more random keywords. And I was thinking to myself, like, who's someone from like Bitcoin's early history or past that might be in the files in some way or another. So I was trying a few names, and one of the first names I thought of was Benjamin Lawsky, who was the architect of the Bit license in New York, which was like the first major regulation around Bitcoin. There wasn't even really like a crypto industry back then. It was still like mainly just Bitcoin. And that was in the state of New York. And they were having hearings at the time, and they were going to develop this license where if you wanted to do anything related to Bitcoin and other digital currencies, you need to have this license. And it was perceived as like a very onerous regulation at the time. I remember there was companies, I want to say Shapeshift was one of the main ones. They would do this thing where, since they didn't want to get the Bit license, they would instead, on their website, it would say, our services are available to everyone except in these locations. And it would say North Korea, Iran, and the state of New York. So that's kind of how the regulation was perceived in the Bitcoin industry. But anyways, Epstein did meet with Lawsky while he was putting together the Bit license regulation. And at the time, Epstein was obviously interested in Bitcoin as well. There's another email where he's talking about Lawsky needs to give Bitcoin like there'd be no state sales tax on Bitcoin transactions or something like that. obviously Lawsky went on to, after this, join the board of Ripple and be involved with some of the companies that he was creating regulations for in the first place. NYDIG was another one of the companies, and they ended up getting a bit license like 7 or 9 months after Lawsky joined the company. So
we are CleanSpark, America's Bitcoin miner, a publicly traded company with the largest operating hash rate, powered entirely by self-operated infrastructure across 4 states. This is our proof of work, and we are setting the standard for what's next. Learn more about the intersection of energy and Bitcoin at cleanspark.com.
Yeah, and it's hard to overstate how hostile the BitLicense was to doing business in New York for Bitcoin and crypto companies. I mean, to your point about Shapeshift, I remember early on, for a while there after it was implemented, like basically any crypto service you could imagine would have that disclaimer where it's like, we don't service New York residents, right? And there were a few, I think like Coinbase probably had one early on. I would be shocked if they didn't. I could be totally wrong about that, but it was a very select few, you know, who were blessed to have this license to operate in the state of New York.
I remember Gemini was one of the first ones too, because their whole thing at the time was we're going to be like the trusted name in Bitcoin for the next 100 years or something like that. So they wanted to be like the most regulatory compliant exchange. So I remember them being like one of the first ones, the Winklevoss twins and Gemini.
And the Winklevoss twins, actually, Brock Pierce, a conduit for Epstein and the Winklevoss twins. He met with, I think, Tyler.
Yeah. It's
unclear if anything really came of that.
I saw the emails that were like, I think Epstein reached out and was like, do you know the Winklevoss twins?
Yeah.
And Brock, there was like some, maybe they were going to meet up or something. But
yeah, they probably met at some point, but it doesn't look like anything came of it. I think that's another really important caveat for a lot of this is just because someone met with Epstein, that doesn't necessarily mean they were doing anything illegal or like morally horrendous, right? It's just this guy had a lot of money. Early stage Bitcoin companies struggled to even have banking relationships. So anyone saying that they're going to fund your startup, you know, you're going to give them the time of day. But going back to the note about him requesting for tax advantageous legislation for Bitcoin, how do you square that with what we ended up getting with the bit license? I mean, I know this is all speculation, but like, what's your read on why, you know, ostensibly Epstein was maybe meeting with Ben Lawsky regarding the bit license or just regulation in general, but he also seemed to take maybe a lenient or was encouraging a lenient stance on the taxation front?
Well, to be clear, the taxation email, that was like an email he sent to the person that I think it was the same person that eventually set up the meeting with Lawsky for him. Lawsky came to Epstein's home for the meeting, I think later that year. So, you know, it's unclear exactly what they talked about when they met. And I'd say it's like unclear, like it's hard to get Epstein's like complete thoughts on Bitcoin just from like all these random emails where he's saying, you know, there's some where he's like, Bitcoin's interesting, but there's all these problems I see with it and it needs to be fixed. So like, I mean, what does he mean there? Does he mean like back then, like that could mean so many different things. People thought like Tether was a way to do Bitcoin right or something like that, like which completely like throws out the whole point of Bitcoin. So that kind of gets into like what his actual thoughts were on Bitcoin. And I'm not, you know, that it's kind of unclear to me.
Yeah, you're not clairvoyant, so you can't reach into the mind of a dead man, right? So is there anything else that because I think just to highlight the Ben Lawsky thing, and kudos to you for just conjuring that name out of the air and thinking, well, this guy was important. Let's see if he was talking to Epstein.
Well, it was like, because those are the kinds of people that are all over the files. It's like the people that work in government, create regulations, and then go work for the very companies that they just wrote regulations for. So it's like, there's not, I mean, you could say there's not a lot of direct connection with a lot of these people in terms of the kind of activities Epstein was into that he was charged for. But there's still these people that are like willing to, you know, further their own ends by working with them and not really caring about any of that stuff. And so like someone who's going to go work in government, create a license, and then effectively profit off that by working for these companies that are going to get regulated with the same regulations that he created. There was even an email that I also shared underneath the original Lawsky one, where it's like someone marketing an investment in NYDIG to Epstein, and like in the marketing materials, it says, we have the best regulatory compliance. We're going to work with regulators. We even have this guy that invented and created and architected the BitLicense is on our board, or whatever his role was at NYDIG. I forget the exact role. So like he's going into government, creating a license, and then profiting off it by, working with those same companies.
Yeah, I've got those tweets up here. Let's go ahead and read this really quickly. You say here, I also found, so actually let me back up really quickly for those who haven't seen the original. This is on Kyle's X account. Highly recommend go and follow him. A great reporting on this. And like I said, this is just, I think, a great find, and the fact that you just dug this up. He says, you tweet here at the time, Lawsky, according to emails in the DOJ files, Jeffrey Epstein met with New York Superintendent of Financial Services, Ben Lawsky, in 2014. At the time, Lawsky was developing the BitLicense for the New York Department of Financial Services. And then down in this second tweet, you say, also found an email forwarded to Epstein that appears to be an explainer on NYDIG. During a time the fund was raising money, Lawsky is touted as the creator of the BitLicense. And this email says, the fund is audited by Ernst & Young. I believe this is the NYDIG fund, the only crypto fund Ernst & Young audit globally, and administrated by the Bank of New York. Stone Ridge are also working closely with the SEC. Stone Ridge is NYDIG's parent company, as they go through the registration process to make sure they are comfortable with all the facets of the fund and ensure the fund is SEC registered. It will likely be the first fund of their type to achieve this status. They also have work and have dialogues with the regulators, which is very important, and count Ben Lawsky, the ex-superintendent of financial services for New York State and the creator of BitLicense, as the first regulatory scheme for the digital currency business as their head of regulatory affairs. Just going back to kind of something we've already highlighted, I think one of the real values of this is just seeing how these laws, how these regulations, and how these money flows kind of move in the background without people realizing it. If Jeffrey Epstein was involved in some way with coaxing on or ushering in the BitLicense, that would give us a very clear indication of maybe his, of some of his motives with getting involved with some of these companies. We don't know because we only get so much from these filings. Let's touch on Blockstream really quickly, and then I want to get to MIT. We won't cover too much about, if you like Google, or if you go to the Epstein files and you look up Austin Hill, the co-founder of Blockstream, he's kind of all over it. I don't want to necessarily get into like what that means for him personally, because I think at least for me, what's more interesting is just looking at how Epstein approached these companies and how he approached some of the people in the companies to make connections with other Bitcoiners and early stage startups in the space at the time. But going back to Blockstream, and there's an MIT tie-in here too, because Epstein ended up investing in Blockstream through Joichi Ito, who was the director of the MIT Media Lab at the time. They set up a joint LLC. I think it's called the Kigari Investment Fund. Joichi put in like $2,000. One of Epstein's shell companies put in $500,000 and then $1, so like 500,000 and $1, and they funneled that money to Blockstream. Adam Back has claimed that fund divested their shares shortly after due to a conflict of interest. Who knows if that's because maybe someone at Blockstream actually figured out who was offering the money, and they said no, thank you. We don't really know what's behind that.
They didn't confirm this, but it looked like there was a conflict of interest because either Ito or Epstein were investing in Stellar. So I don't know if there was like one of Austin Hill's email was like an email to Ito, Epstein, and I think Reid Hoffman as well, because Reid Hoffman was an investor in Blockstream also.
Why would that be a conflict of interest for their investment in Blockstream?
Obviously, there's the conflict where Stellar has its own digital currency on its L1, and then so Blockstream's trying to build out basically everything on Bitcoin with its own token. Blockstream never really had any success with like their liquid sidechain thing, but part of what that's used for and what they thought it was going to be used for is like a lot of the tokenization type stuff, and that they even say some of that in the email. So I think it would be probably more. They see Stellar as a competitor to Liquid would be my interpretation of it. So yeah, and then Adam Back, who's the CEO of Blockstream now, even said there was a conflict of interest, and that specific email from Austin Hill lines up with what he's saying basically. Now, that doesn't mean that's what happened, but there's like supporting evidence for that being the case.
Yeah, thank you for that color. I had not seen anything about this Stellar or Ripple in the
Well, I saw that
filing.
because like all these Ripple people were saying like this proves that Epstein was using Bitcoin to attack Ripple and all this like crazy stuff. I'm like, it actually looks like more the opposite. Like Epstein was invested in Ripple or Stellar based on this email.
Right. That's what I find really funny about this. I mean, if you go to like the Bcash subreddit,
Oh yeah, I'm sure.
or which subreddit is like co-opted by Bcash? Is it RBTC or is it RBitcoin? Which one is like
RBTC is the one that splintered off from our Bitcoin back during the Blocksize War.
Yeah, if you go to RBTC and then I guess RBitcoin Cash as well, they've been on this trail for a long time. I don't know when. I think it goes back to the original findings of the MIT's ties to Epstein. There have been dumps of the files throughout the years, and little glimpses behind the curtain. This is obviously the most thorough one yet. But going back to what you were saying about the Ripple people using this as a kind of, as proof or evidence of Epstein trying to crush their beautiful little Ponzi coin over there. The same thing with a lot of people in the Bitcoin Cash community. Some even, I would say, within the like kind of the filter or knots community now as well, talking about how, there are all these enclaves basically pointing to the files and saying Epstein was driving Bitcoin development, core is compromised, etc. And there's
I mean, that's been one of the more interesting parts of all this to me, following like the actual files. It's like how each little offshoot, like you said, that's not really Bitcoin is like using it to say Bitcoin's hijacked and all that kind of stuff. And, I kind of stopped interacting with the knots people just because they were getting so ridiculous. Like they're just not going to listen. So it's like they can just fork off the network, I guess, if they want to keep going down this path and learn the hard way, like the Bitcoin Cash people had to learn. But one of the points I was making to them over and over again is like they're doing the same exact thing that the big Bitcoin Cash people were back in the day. They're just coming at it from like a different angle. So like you could say the Bitcoin Cash and even like more of the crypto people, like Ethereum people, were like very progressive in how they wanted the network to develop from like a technical development standpoint. So they wanted like all this tokenization stuff. They wanted bigger block size for more on-chain payments, all that kind of stuff. And so, which just like didn't make any sense. And now so a lot of them became like Blockstream conspiracy theorists, basically saying they're, controlled by the banks or whatever it was back then. And now the knots people are doing sort of the same thing, but they're saying they're coming to it from more like a conservative angle, where they're saying Bitcoin has to only be used as money, and we have to, implement this so strictly that we might even, end up limiting some of the functionality of some of these layer 2s that need more expressive scripting at the base layer for Bitcoin itself to scale as money. So it's like they're doing like the same sort of thing from like the opposite angle, which I think is really interesting just from like a psychology standpoint. And so, I've seen a lot of that. And with the Ripple people, like I said before, they're just all kind of, I don't know. I mean, it's also like, it's just this righteous cause that they think they're protecting Bitcoin. It was the same kind of thing with the Bitcoin Cash people where they're like, we need to, makes me think of Roger Ver talking about, babies are dying because they can't use Bitcoin on chain for, pennies for transaction fees that are pennies. It's all
right.
Very wild stuff. Yeah. I don't want to get like all down that knots rabbit hole because it's
we don't have
stupid.
to. and my co-host Charlie Spears will be happy to not do it because he's been very front and center in the ordinals and inscriptions world, and so he's been caught in the crossfire about all of the filter war stuff.
Yeah.
Man. And I kind of just sit by. I'm not as invested in it, like literally and emotionally in terms of the inscription stuff. So I just kind of sit back and chuckle, but maybe that's the wrong approach. I want to maybe close on MIT, but since we're kind of already talking about it, I want to just go kind of push further into the realm of speculation. One take I've heard is if you look at the way that Epstein moved money and the way that he tried to broker influence across anything, and this might include Bitcoin, you see him taking both sides of an argument or both sides of a position or funding both sides of some sort of, axis of political thought in the US. And I think one way that some people that I've talked to about this who have been deep in Bitcoin for a while, they're reading Epstein's involvement with Blockstream and also Coinbase, exerting influence and injecting capital into MIT, as maybe a way to put chips on every single player, and with the hopes of either betting on the right one that comes out on top, or even potentially stoking conflict between these different parties within the Bitcoin ecosystem. And specifically, the block wars has kind of become one of the things that people point to, I think, to show that he was trying to play both sides of this with Blockstream and Coinbase. Do you buy that? Does that make any sense to you? Have you seen anything that would indicate that that might be the case, or you think that's just pure speculation, kind of game theorizing this?
It does seem, I mean, he does seem like he was using his money to gain influence in a lot of ways too, not necessarily just making investments for, the purpose of making money. But like you said, I mean, yeah, when the original release came out last year, that was another thing where people hopped on it originally and were like, see, this proves that Bitcoin Core is corrupt because they were funded by MIT, who was funded by Epstein. But it's like, well, at the time, Gavin Andresen was the one pushing for Bitcoin XT, which was a different implementation, which would like have hard forked the network and created an entirely different network. So the idea that it was like Bitcoin Core or small blockers didn't make any sense. And when it comes to the block size stuff specifically, I think he was probably not necessarily thinking about that as much. I think he was this was like the simplest explanation would be like, this is a new technology and he just wanted to invest in these various companies that were starting at the time. And I think when you look at it from that perspective, it would make sense they would have, investments on different sides because he wasn't even considering that aspect of it. That would be my assessment of that. I don't think he was looking to like influence Bitcoin Core development because, like I said, he's funding Gavin Andresen and the other guys at MIT, and then he's also funding Blockstream. And plus, Bitcoin, the way it works inherently is meant to avoid that kind of manipulation in the first place because it is this open source system where anyone can contribute. So like he wouldn't, even if he tried to do that, I don't think it would work.
All right, I'm going to put the tinfoil hat on and play Alex Jones a little bit. So Gavin Andresen met with the CIA and Epstein in June of 2011. The Bitcoin XT hard fork or proposal comes out in June 2015. I mean, it's 4 years separation, but if you wanted to go down the rabbit hole and again, kind of get cosmic with the conspiracy, you might ask the question, was there anything said to Gavin during those CIA meetings and with Epstein that would have maybe influenced him to go this route? From what you know about Gavin, do you think this is just him doing what he was going to do regardless? I mean, I know that it used to be fallen out of favor.
I definitely disagreed with Gavin a lot on technical stuff. One of the things that was also in that Coinbase investor letter that was sent to Epstein was this concept of miner voting, which Brian Armstrong was talking about a lot at the time. He was like, this is how Bitcoin upgrades. We, propose this hard fork, and then if the miners vote to pass it, then it passes. But that's not really how it works when it comes to hard forks, as we saw over and over again with the various hard fork proposals. Now, it is true in terms of soft forks. If you get a bunch of miners to support it, like if 95% of miners are supporting a soft fork, it's going to go through smoothly, but you still need like the consensus of the nodes.
The timing, I mean, it's coming 4 years after he met with the CIA and with Epstein, but...
Oh, right, the CIA, okay.
Yeah.
Maybe, but I think I would go back to the point where like if that did happen, it didn't work because Gavin was removed as lead maintainer once he started saying Craig Wright is Satoshi. So like no one took him seriously after that. And he was already not being taken seriously by a lot of the core developers at the time because he was like pushing this hard fork. so hard, and it like clearly didn't have consensus from the other developers.
But it almost doesn't matter in the sense that it was too ridiculous that no one took it
Yeah.
seriously. So like,
It's
even if
similar to,
you
like,
do,
similar
ahead.
like when people try to say someone is Satoshi, like there was a lot of nonsense about Epstein as Satoshi. It's like, it doesn't, at this point, it doesn't even matter because the network is like been running for so long and it's completely open source and so many changes have been made over the years. And like, it's everything's out in the open when it comes to actual development work on the protocol. So yeah, I mean, you can go down those rabbit holes if you want. I used to go down a lot of, when I was a younger man, I used to listen to a lot of Alex Jones. And I mean, it can be fun. And I even like learned some things I didn't know from people like Alex Jones. But I don't know if it doesn't like actually matter because Gavin got removed anyways. So I don't really, it's kind of a waste of time to try to figure out like what was going on there to me.
What do you think is worth kind of cluing into outside of what we've talked about, though? Is there anything in the files that you think, outside of the things that you brought to light, that you think are like, this is still relevant, this is still important? Like, I can't really think of Brock Pierce as still being relevant. It is insane and fascinating that he was in contact with Epstein basically from like 2010 up until 2018, and he was
right.
his blockchain capital was basically a surrogate fund to funnel Epstein's investments into early stage Bitcoin companies, and Brock Pierce himself kind of seemed to serve this liaison role, matching Epstein with potential investments. But
well, I mean, Brock Pierce does have some accusations himself from a very long time ago, so maybe it's not, completely crazy that he's in there so often. But I mean, the most interesting stuff to me is, more of the stuff related to Bitcoin itself rather than, people communicating with Epstein after all these years because they invested in his companies. I mean, yeah, maybe people should be removed from roles or whatever. I don't really get into that very much. I was just more interested in the Coinbase bit, specifically about how they were dealing with the Blocksize war. And then Lawsky was just kind of interesting. I do think the, all these bad arguments that have been made based on them too is kind of the interesting part right now, as we were talking about like the Ripple and the Bitcoin Cash and the Knots people, just seeing how people like take this information and then weaponize it to support their cause or whatever. I mean, I brought like a lot of the Coinbase stuff out from the files, but like I wasn't doing that to be like, oh, Coinbase is evil and Epstein controlled Coinbase and they were attacking Bitcoin. I was just like, well, no, this is more just to point out that the arguments being made against Blockstream don't make any sense. Like if you're going to make the argument against Blockstream, you have to do it for both sides.
Right. That's a good point. And it's kind of like the Pink Floyd song, Any Color You Like. If you look into the kaleidoscope of the Epstein files, you can probably see through any prism some truth that you want to pull out of the whole thing, right?
I mean, the worst, I have to say this too, the worst one was Vinny Lingham. I don't know if you saw that one or if you know who Vinny Lingham is.
Spill the tea.
Had very bad takes for a very long time in this space. And he had the worst one of all this past week when he was like, well, now I don't even know what to think. Maybe Craig Wright is Satoshi and I don't trust Adam Back anymore. And I'm going to buy. So he was like pumping Bitcoin SV, which is like,
dude, it's like 20,
I don't know of a worse
is it
scam
20
in the space over the entire history.
Is it 2019 again? I mean, seriously.
Yeah, it was just an insanely bad take.
Vinny Lingham, famously of Civic, I believe, was the token, and they were trying to push a vending machine where you would pay in Civic token. And I don't know, pay for your Doritos in a coin that no one asked for and no one wants. Well, Kyle, before we go, I want to zoom in on MIT really quickly because maybe we should have led with this, but we kind of talked about it a good bit on our live stream, and the stuff that you found I thought was more interesting, so I wanted to focus on that. But Epstein reportedly gifted MIT like $825,000, which seems kind of low. I wonder if it's actually more. I would imagine it's actually probably more. And 525,000 of that went to the MIT Media Lab. To Joichi Ito, the director of the MIT Media Lab, specifically for various things. We know that maybe 120,000 of this was given to the Bitcoin Club at MIT, potentially for an airdrop where they gave like every MIT student $100 in Bitcoin if they
Right.
claimed it,
Yeah.
something like that. But Joichi was in contact with Epstein for a long time. He ended up syncing Epstein up with now Bitcoin developer, then undergrad at MIT, Jeremy Rubin. Jeremy also seemed to have been similar to Brock Pierce, a kind of liaison. He attempted to match Epstein up with Layer 1, a Bitcoin miner, and Ledger X for investments. I don't think either of those went through from what I've seen in the files. There was not confirmation, at least in this batch.
Well, yeah,
But-
that was probably I forgot about that one. That was probably the funniest email I saw related to Bitcoin, where Jeremy's trying to pitch him on Layer 1, which I think before this is what Jeremy responded on X, because people were saying it was actually supposed to be like kind of like Blockstream, but for Grin. If you remember Grin, it was like an altcoin based on the Mimblewimble protocol, so it'd be like scalable and private. So Layer 1 was originally allegedly supposed to be like the Blockstream of Grin, where they would buy a bunch of Grin in the initial token offering or whatever, and then like build out wallet infrastructure and other services and stuff around it. So you'd basically be like increasing the value of the Grin tokens over time by like building on top of the protocol. But that's the email where he says, Epstein's like, I have ethical concerns, or it can't be anything ethically bad because I don't want to, ruin my reputation.
Which is hilarious, obviously, considering what we know about his actual moral fiber. But he didn't want to invest in shitcoins. So a quick redaction from me there. Then I assumed that it was the Bitcoin miner Layer 1. Seems like it was a different company entirely.
No, because I was confused about that too. But on X, Jeremy said that that was the original idea with Layer 1 was the Grin thing, and then they ended up like not even participating in Grin at all or something, and then they just pivoted to Bitcoin mining.
Got it.
So I think it is the same company.
Okay. So
I remember making like outlandish claims about like how much of the hash rate they were going to have and stuff like that around the time
for Bitcoin.
For Bitcoin, if I'm thinking of the same company, yeah.
Okay. What do you make of the MIT relationship in general? I mean, is there anything particularly special here, or do you think it's just kind of par for the course with Epstein trying to broker influence with these institutions?
Yeah, I mean, I would think it's an influence thing. I know there's a lot of like stuff about, tax related reasons why you would maybe do that kind of stuff too. But like I said, I mean, if he's investing in MIT and Blockstream and Coinbase, it's like, I'm not sure what he would be trying to do necessarily to influence Bitcoin. There is before we came on, you were talking about the chain anchor protocol as well, which was like a paper out of MIT where they were talking about how to, if I recall correctly, it was like how to incentivize Bitcoin miners to implement KYC AML on all transactions. And so basically they would just give miners like an economic incentive by paying higher fees to, force them to censor all non-whitelisted transactions or something like that. And I did report on that at the time, and MIT was being kind of weird because the original paper was all about Bitcoin and how it would be deployed on Bitcoin. And then when I was talking to them, they're like, oh, we never wanted this to be deployed on Bitcoin at all. It's more of just like a general blockchain thing. I think that was, I don't know if you can pull up like when, I don't even remember when this article I wrote was, but if you can pull it to the time, I think it was like 2017 or something. All right, so 2016. So it is, I guess, in the same, few years there. But as far as I know, like nothing came of Chainacre. I remember Peter Todd writing about it around the same time, just being like, this is a terrible idea. And I think it goes back to the same point where it's like, this kind of ruins the whole value proposition here in the first place. So we're not going to, there's no reason to adopt it, and it just kind of went away pretty quickly after it first was revealed.
Yeah, it's certainly interesting to at least ponder maybe how Epstein's influence could have led to something like that, or maybe that's why he had an interest in MIT to begin with. This is all speculation. We don't know. Yeah. But if you look
if you look at some of his emails where he's talking about there's problems with Bitcoin and it needs to be fixed or whatever, maybe he thought like it needed to be regulated and have, full KYC AML at the protocol level. Like maybe.
Yeah, 100%. That would gel with how Bitcoin was explained to him in the beginning. I mean, he was going through Jason Calacanis. He has this funny email
It's
where he
Pal
goes,
J Cal.
yeah, right. It's hilarious though. He emails Calacanis and he says, "I would like to meet the Bitcoin guys," and he does bit and coin as two separate words. And Jason Calacanis responds, hey, by the way, these guys are like kind of they're like WikiLeaks, in the sense that they're kind of burn it all down, anarcho-capitalism, permissionless money, all that stuff. And so in the early days, Epstein, especially with getting briefed on the subject, especially back then when most people only knew Bitcoin, if at all, via its use on the Silk Road, it would have been framed completely differently, I think, than the way that it's framed to most people today. State actors wanting to have more controls over payment flows in Bitcoin makes a lot of sense. This is something, going back to the chain and anchor thing, this is still one of the largest risks to Bitcoin today, in the sense of, you look at Foundry being based in the US and like 40% of the hash rate coming from publicly listed companies. That's a choke point for actually putting in some sort of transaction controlling measure where you're whitelisting or blacklisting transactions that you don't want included, or rather transactions from blacklisted wallets that you don't want included in the blockchain. This is kind of a tangent, but I actually think the AI expansions and pivots that we're seeing from public miners is probably the healthiest thing to happen to Bitcoin since the China mining ban. Like we had Chinese miners, occupying like 80%ish, maybe more of the hash rate, gets banned. Most of that moves to the US. You have another bottleneck, another kind of choke point with the majority of the hash rate, or just under the majority, being here. Now a lot of those miners are just they won't be doing it in 4 years. I don't think. They will have very negligible hash rate footprints, if at all. And who knows where that hash rate's going to go. But you've at least hopefully neutralized that threat vector. If Foundry still has 30 to 40% of the hash rate, though, it doesn't really go away. You really only need to go after the mining pools. But
yeah, I mean, there's been a lot made out of like the quantum computing issue lately, but I don't really. I see the mining centralization issue as like much more immediate and potentially problematic, because, like, as you said, if the transaction templates, the block templates, are not decentralized, then you can just kind of target a few entities and then start implementing AML KYC like MIT was thinking about doing all those years ago. What's even crazier to me is, like, back then I assumed like that was definitely going to be implemented on Tether. And Tether's, obviously, if you want to redeem Tether via Tether, you still have to go through AML KYC, but you can transfer it around without any of your personal information being tied to your USDT at all. So I'm pretty shocked that's been allowed to keep going all these years.
Yeah, and it seems like maybe some of that's coming with some of the Genius framework. I mean, Tether now has a compliant stablecoin.
Yeah.
I think it's like USAT, maybe, that Anchorage Digital is like the first or the only issuer for it. Anchorage is federally chartered. But going back to Tether, interestingly, very sparsely mentioned in the Epstein files. And I think Tether has always had all sorts of conspiracy swirling around it. I mean, if it wasn't the Tether is pumping Bitcoin's price, that was a really popular argument from some of the fringe crypto hating journalists back in the day.
Oh yeah, I mean, Bitfinex is still around, apparently. I don't know if you're familiar with that X account.
Yeah, is it run by Caspianci, or do you know what I'm talking about?
Oh, that would be funny if it was,
because he's
like the Protos. I think he
writes at Protos now. He blocked me a long time ago. I don't remember what it was for, but it was like, it was him.
Account blocked me a long time ago, but then unblocked me once I started reporting on the Epstein stuff. So,
well, there was this universe back then, not to get too in the weeds of the good old days before we got institutionalized. You can read that any way you want, either Bitcoin being institutionalized or literally we're all going insane being in this industry too long. But, it was like Amy Castor, David Gerard, I believe his name was, and Caspianci, who were pushing this narrative that, Tethers aren't backed by anything and they're artificially inflating Bitcoin's price. Right. So, I mean, that's pretty well discredited at this point, at least I would hope. I still think maybe Amy is somewhere kind of in her corner screaming to the world that Bitcoin's about to go to zero. But there's a kind of a newer one that, you know, I don't want to like throw shade on this one too much, because I think going back to like Genius compliance, there might be a case here. It's the idea that like a CBDC in the US would be in the form of a privately issued stablecoin that comes with these compliance measures that are approved by the state, basically. I don't really have much else to say about this other than, if that were the case, I'd expect Tether to be featured a little more prominently in these things, if like, you know, there was some conspiracy behind it. But then again, maybe it wasn't big enough at the time. Brock Pierce does mention it a little bit to Jeffrey.
Brock Pierce is a Tether co-founder.
Yeah. So, so he mentions it a few times, and I think he was trying to get, funnily enough, he was going back to the nuggets in here. He was trying to get Larry Summer involved with Tether, maybe like on the board or something like that. I think maybe as like a seal of legitimacy for the project, as well as one of his like thing. yeah, exactly. And then you have some other emails of someone explaining to Epstein how stable coins work, but there's not really too much in there about Tether, which I was a little surprised.
I would imagine maybe Epstein was like, this is too volatile, and I could see him being interested in something like Tether. Did launch that, you know, regulatory compliant one version of their stablecoin in the US, but I don't know if anyone's going to actually use that. I think what they're doing in El Salvador is like much more interesting. And some people don't like, some like Bitcoiners really don't like Tether because it's like this centralized stablecoin or whatever. But the reality is they hold a lot of Bitcoin. They keep buying Bitcoin. And I think longer term, it would make sense. The reason like USDT is more interesting to me than like the regulatory compliant one is like, Bitcoin gives them kind of like a hedge against the US dominance over the world economic system. So like if they were completely backed by US treasuries, the US could just seize their assets or whatever. I think they're held at Cantor Fitzgerald, if I'm not mistaken. So like Bitcoin is kind of a hedge against that US centric system where they could keep operating if they had enough Bitcoin to back their stable coin over the long term. And that gets into like very, you know, I think that kind of gets into like what Hal Finney was originally talking about way back in the day. Like one of his first responses to the Bitcoin paper was like, yeah, Bitcoin banks will actually make a lot of sense.
Tether, one of the more interesting companies, man. They also have a huge mining arm. You know, they have a hash rate that is close to or on par with some of the largest public miners in the US. And also they have like 140. Yeah, it's a lot. They're very quiet about it. We're hoping we're going to have some content on that over the next month or so, but they also hold like 140 tons of gold, which is just insane. All right, Kyle, we're running up on an hour here. Is there anything else that we didn't cover that you would like to double tap or tap in final thoughts before we close out?
Maybe a closing thought would be, you know, don't believe everything an altcoiner is telling you about Bitcoin being hijacked, whether it's, you know, the Bcash people, the Knots people who aren't, I guess they're not technically altcoiners yet, but if they fork themselves off the network, they will be. And then the Ripple people. Think for yourself, I guess, instead of, you know, listening to someone who's trying to sell you something.
Well said. Kyle, where can people find you? Where can people find your work?
I think my X account is the best place to follow me. Just x.com/Kyle Torpy.
Well, Kyle, thank you so much for joining, man. It's great to see you. Great to touch base. Hope you have a good week.
You too. Yeah. Thanks for having me.